Hi, everyone. So we're going to start off with the programming lecture this time again. Now is week 10, and we're going to cover event handlers and conditionals. Before that, here are some announcements. So homework 8 was due before class today, as usual, and homework 9 will be released tonight. And then some reminders about final project. So the check-ins are due this Thursday on April 15th. So make sure to attend an office hours section from any of the TAs or instructors and get your checkoffs done as soon as possible. Checking off during lab section is not ideal, and we're not completely sure if we're going to allow that yet, but try to at least go to one office hours. And if you do have like time conflicts or if you're short on time, email a TA beforehand and tell them that like you have to be checked off as soon as possible, and they'll let you go in front of the line so you don't have to wait for everyone else to be checked off. And the product deadline is Tuesday, April 27th, 11:59 p.m. So make sure you get your final projects in to the Google form by Tuesday, April 27th. And the final project submission link is again at wdg.io/go/project-submit. And if you want any inspirations for your design, you can look at our past websites that people have submitted for this project on the showcase website that is linked in the lecture slide as well. And then as always, if you have any questions about assignments or the final project, feel free to go to any of our office hours, which are posted on Piazza, or visit that link. And if you have any anonymous feedback for us, please leave them at wdd.io/go/feedback. So these are just some, like, I guess, memes related to like JavaScript encoding. JavaScript is a very coveted skill, as you can see on the left side. Someone asking for JavaScript help at like 2 a.m. in the morning. And then on the right side, this is a screenshot from like a random video about how people use coding and algorithms to make sure that the drones aren't crashing into each other. And then the bottom right, there's like a screenshot of someone just memeing that. So like if you're going to crash into each other, just don't, which is not how you implement that in real life, but it's just a representation of like kind of like how people, I guess, view scenarios like that in like code. So moving on to the actual lecture now, we've seen this sentence like multiple times before, and it basically kind of represents all of what we've learned so far with JavaScript. And previously in the last two lectures, we focused more on like the actual change from like different styles and like applying that change to like a button or a link or an image element on the page. But today we're actually going to cover the clicking part. So what happens when the user clicks on a button, link, or image? That clicking is what we're going to implement today. So before that, we're going to go into some review of what we've learned before, since we rely on previous concepts in order to implement this new like clicking or interaction functionality. So we have this line of code here. It says let food equals document.getElementById in quotation marks food list. So if you guys could pop in your answer into the Zoom chat for what does food return, and then we can like discuss. Okay, yeah, so someone in the chat said DOM object, and that is correct. So yeah, last lecture we covered like what exactly the DOM is, and it stands for document object model. And when you do document.getElementById, it returns a DOM object. And we also covered what objects are in the last lecture too. So if you want a refresher on that, please visit the last week's lecture slides. But basically, this returns an object that is part of the DOM. And that object has like multiple properties and functions that you can call or access. And that object corresponds to the element that has the ID food list. Next, we have a very similar line of code, except now the getElementById is replaced by querySelector. put in the chat what you think the food returns now. Someone asked, what if you tried to print the output? So we saw this in the last lecture, actually. We tried to print out the object itself in the console. And basically, you'll just see that it's an object with like multiple properties and functions. And it's a very, very long list of properties and functions. But in this class, we don't deal with like all of them. We just deal with a few of those properties and functions that are most important to like what we cover in class. Does anyone want to take a stab at what this returns? Okay, so yeah, someone answered it correctly. It actually returns the exact same thing as the previous line of code. It also returns a DOM object, and that object corresponds to the element that has the ID food list. So the only difference between these two is that, like, the first one, it doesn't need that hashtag selector. It can just take in food list as a string because it already has getElementById as the function itself. And then this one is based on the selector. So if you wanted to get an element with a certain class or just an element with a certain tag, you can just use querySelector for that. And that's why you have to pass in the hashtag here. And another differentiation between getElementById and querySelector is that querySelector returns the very first element that matches the selector. So in the case you have like multiple food lists with the exact same ID, which is not ideal because like you should only use ID for one element. But if in the chance that you do have multiple lists that are called food lists, it will only return the very first one that it finds and it won't return all of them. So that's one of the differences between getElementById and querySelector. Moving on, so this is a very simple line of code. It says food.classList. And what does this return? So like imagine if you just like console.logged this line of code into your like console. What would it output? Yeah, so it would return a list of all the classes that belong to the element food or the object food. So yeah, class list is a property of this food object. And so when you do the dot notation by typing in food.classList, you essentially get the property class list from the object food. And this property class list is basically an array or a list of all of the class names that belong to this food. Next, we have food.classList.add foo. So what does this do? Yeah, exactly. All of you guys are right. So it adds the class foo to the object. And unlike the other like pieces of code that we saw, if you console.log this, there would be no output because it doesn't return anything. It just has an action that it does, but it doesn't like have an output, if that makes sense. But basically the action that it does is that it adds the string foo as like one of the class names to the object food. So yeah, if you like visualize this in your head, it's like you have the previous class list, which is like a list of string values, and you're just adding the new string, which is foo, to the end of that class list. Is it possible to have a class dot hashtag foo? I would say no, because I think that would like trip up the compiler. Like I don't think the browser would understand what that means, like if you have a dot and a hashtag. Yeah, I feel like that's illegal. I don't think you should have like punctuation or like the punctuation marks that you use should not be like a period or a hashtag because then it gets confusing with like classes and IDs. Okay, next example is the same as before, except now we're removing bar. So what does this do? I kind of just gave it away, but yeah, it removes the class. So basically, like if you had a class called bar assigned to the element food, this line of code basically just removes that class from the class list. So it will no longer have the class bar. Yay, okay, you guys passed that quiz. Moving on to the actual topic of our lecture, which is DOM and event handlers. So here is a review of like what exactly the DOM is. So DOM is the document object model, and it basically represents the entire page and all of its subcomponents. So you see here, there's like the document with like the properties, title, functions, getElementById, createElement. And then within the document, you have a child element, which is body. And the body object has its own properties and functions. And then within body, they have, it has more child elements, which include h1 and the unordered list food list. So yeah, this is basically a representation of our food list web page. And this shows like kind of the hierarchical structure as well as like the properties and functions that are within each of these objects of the document. So when we do document.getElementById on food lists, essentially what we're saying is that from our DOM or document object model, we want to find the element that has the ID food list. And so basically what it's doing is that it's like kind of going from like top to bottom of this tree, and it tries to find the unordered list that's with the ID of food list. JavaScript is event-driven, which means that everything that happens in JavaScript can be characterized by events. And events are actions that you can take as a user when you're interacting with a website, which includes hovering, clicking, and typing on different like elements. Some examples of this are on mouse over, on click, and on key press. So if you go into your browser and go to like www.io, for example, and you click inspect element and you open the console on the right side, there's a tab that's called event listeners. And here you can see like all of the different types of event listeners that are in implementation, or like all of the event listeners that are implemented in our website. And so you can see that there's like mouse up, ready state change, DOM content loaded, etc. So these are all like the different kinds of JavaScript events that are happening within the background of this website. So with the DOM, we can change different elements on our screen. Previously with pseudo selectors like hover or like focus, for example, we can only access the element that we selected. But with JavaScript, when we trigger an event, we can access the entire tree. So we can access any element that exists within the DOM model. So for example, if you want to click on a list element in this unordered list, and we want to modify the h1 tag, we can do that with JavaScript by using events. Whereas if we're only using pseudo selectors, we can only modify the li tag itself. So every DOM element object has an onClick function. So here we see an example code on the left side where we have a pop-up button that is, yeah, basically a button. And when you want to click on it, it wants to trigger the function called showGreeting. And the function showGreeting basically just alerts howdy in your browser. Note that showGreeting on the last line is without parentheses, which means that you're assigning this function to this onClick property and you're not calling the function directly. A lot of people make mistakes with this because they think that like, oh, if it's a function, you have to have parentheses after it. But here we're not actually calling the function. So you want to make sure that there's no parentheses following the name of the function. Instead, you're trying to assign the value of this function to this onClick property. And show greeting can be called with different event handlers. So before we were assigning it to the onClick property, but we can also assign it to the onMouseOver property. So here, like if you moused your cursor over the pop-up button, it would trigger this function and then alert Howdy. Whereas before, it's based on the actual like clicking action. Yeah, so you can replace this with any JavaScript event, including onMouseOver, onKeyPress, or onClick, and they're all valid use cases. And also note that we can assign functions directly. So here we're actually using something called an anonymous function. So in the previous slide, we defined the function by itself and we named it show greeting, but we can also do the same thing without the function name. So we can directly assign this anonymous function that essentially does the exact same thing as before, and we can assign it directly to the onClick property. So this is a lot more concise and a lot faster. But I think when it comes to it, like I think it depends on what you prefer, because like to me, I think this makes a lot of sense because like you know what that function is doing. But if you have a very simple function, you want to assign it to like an onClick event, then you can do this as well. But yeah, this is just generally a more concise and shorter way to say the exact same thing as the previous slide. Someone asked, does clicking on the button element, something like button element.onClick, do something? Oh, does clicking on the button element do something like button element.onClick? Yes, so that's a good question because you can actually trigger the onClick from your JavaScript. So you don't even have to have your like actual user like click the button itself. If you want to like, I don't know, maybe like a use case would be where like you have multiple things happening in a waterfall scenario. So like you have the user hover over a button and that triggers like another button to be clicked or something like that. You can also do that in JavaScript. Like you can trigger the onClick function yourself and that will essentially call like the show greeting function from before if you're doing it that way. So yeah, that's a good question. You can actually call the onClick yourself through your code, but generally that's not what people usually do. Usually it's like the user clicks the button. So now we're going to cover alternative styling with JavaScript. We don't have to, so before like we showed you guys how to change the styles of certain components on your web page by using classes, but you don't have to add or remove classes to modify CSS. Instead, you can use the style property and basically assign style.property to a string value. And this tells the CSS that you want to change this property directly. So here's an example on the left side. You have a button element and you have a box element. And basically what you want to do is to change the color, or specifically change the background color of the box element when you click on the button element. So as you can see on the bottom, we used an anonymous function to assign this like change color, or like you want to call the change color function from this anonymous function that happens when you click on the button element. So kind of like walking through what is happening. So here we have button element.onClick, which is equal to this anonymous function. So when the user clicks on the button, it runs this anonymous function. And inside this anonymous function, we have the change color function being called. And the change color function, as you can see here, it takes a parameter that is named color. And that color is a string value. So here we're passing in a string value that is equal to the color red. And so basically it calls this change color function with the color red, and it assigns this color red, which is a string value, to the property background color. And this property background color is a property within the property style, if that makes sense. So it's like the box element is an object that has a property called style, and that style also has a property called background color, and you're assigning this new color, which is red, to that background color. And yeah, like I said, we use anonymous functions here, so we can nest our action in our event handler without having to create like an entirely separate function just to call this change color. In general, when you want to change a CSS property with JavaScript, we recommend just Googling it, because I think that's probably the fastest way you can find the answer to your question. So yeah, if you ever like go to office hours and ask a TA or instructor, like, how do I change this CSS property with JavaScript? We're probably going to tell you to like Google it first. And yeah, I think that's just like the fastest way to like learn how to modify different CSS properties. Okay, now we're going to move on to sort of a more technical coding concept, but it's still very useful, especially for, I guess, interacting with like JavaScript events and changing like classes and styles of the HTML page elements. So the first concept we're going to cover is Boolean expressions. Before that, before we talk about what Boolean actually means, we want to go over what a conditional statement is. So a conditional statement allows you to do different things based on the truthiness of a condition. So you can think of it as like, if X is true, then do Y. And this entire statement is a conditional statement because the condition is X. And so if X is true, then you want to do a certain action, which is Y. And now I'm going to talk about like some operators that people usually use when dealing with conditional statements and Boolean expressions in general. So this is the equality operator. It's the 3 equal signs next to each other, as well as the exclamation mark followed by the 2 equal signs. So the equality operator, basically, it compares if 2 variables are the same type and value. If you've done coding in other languages before, you might notice that they use like 2 equal signs instead of 3. Basically, the 2 equal signs is like comparing the value, whereas the 3 equal signs compares the type and the value. So it doesn't do any type conversion. But for the sake of this class, just use the 3 equal signs and that will be sufficient. Yeah, and then there are also some other relational operators, such as the greater than or less than signs, as well as the greater than or equal to signs and the less than or equal to signs. So these are just very similar to what you might see when you're doing like math. And so the same logic applies to JavaScript. Yeah, and these are some examples of like what expressions using the equality operator would evaluate to. So for example, if you did 1 + 5 = 6, that would evaluate to true. So if you were to like console.log this expression into your browser's console, it would return the output true. And then similarly, if you did 1 = 2, it would evaluate to false, because obviously 1 is not equal to 2, so the value is not the same, even though the type is the same. And then 1 + 5 not equal to 2, that evaluates to true because 1 + 5 is 6, and 6 is not equal to 2. So the statement of 6 being not equal to 2 is true, so it returns true. Someone asked the question, so would the number 1 equals in quotation marks 1 be true, and 1 equals in quotation marks 1 be false? Yeah, I think so, though. Yeah, I think like comparing strings and like numbers are a bit tricky. Like, I think some languages would say false for the first one. But yeah, I think based on like the definition of what the equals sign does, like the 3 equal signs compares both the type and the value, whereas the double equal sign only compares the value. And next we have logic operators, and the logic operators are the two ampersands. So basically the and operator is what we call it. And then we have the two vertical bar symbols, which is the or operator. And then lastly, we have the exclamation mark by itself, which is the not operator. So yeah, if you notice from before when we were talking about equality operators, we have like the exclamation mark in front of the two equal signs. That basically means like not equals. So here, like the exclamation mark by itself is essentially the meaning of not. And we use logic operators as symbols that combine or modify expressions together to create a new expression. And here are some examples of that. So to use the double ampersand symbol, which is the and operator, we can compare like two different, I guess you could say, like conditional statements. So here we have true and false. And obviously, like this is false because you have the false here in the statement, so you can't be true and be false at the same time. So that evaluates to false. The second line is false and false. And so this also evaluates to false because first of all, you already have a false, so that already fails there. So this statement is already false. So yeah, this is also false because you already have a false value inside the conditional statement. And then lastly, we have true and true. And this is true because all of the values that are in this expression are true. And so the final output is also true. But yeah, basically the and operator combines two different conditions and evaluates if both of them are true. So if at least one of them is not true, then it's false. But if all of the conditions inside this and statement is true, then it returns true. Next, we have the or operator, which is indicated by the two vertical bars. So here you can think of it as if x or y, and then true. So previously we had if x and y is true, or is if x and y and then true, but here we have if x or y and then true. So that means if at least one of these conditions are true, then it returns true. So let's walk through some examples here. If we have true or false, this evaluates to true because we have this true condition here. And so given that there's at least one true statement, it evaluates entirely to true. In the second example, we have false or false. And this evaluates to false because there is no true statement inside this or operator expression. So it returns false as the output. And then finally, we have true or true, which obviously returns true because not only is there at least one that's true, but they're both true. So this obviously returns true. And then finally, we have the not operator, which is just the single exclamation mark. And this is pretty simple. So basically, it just returns the opposite value of the expression. So the first example we have here is not true, which is basically false, and then not false, which is basically true. Do statements short circuit? I would say yes. Like I know like other programming languages like Python do that, and I would say that is also correct for JavaScript as well. So like if you had true or false, it would probably just stop evaluating at the beginning because it already saw like the true statement. So it would just like short circuit and return true automatically because you already found at least one true condition. We can take these logical and we can take these logical operators to, I guess, a more complicated level. So we can combine expressions to communicate a very complex, I guess, conditional statement. So for example, we have here in big parentheses, 1 + 2 == 3 in small parentheses, and then combined using an and operator with not, and then in small parentheses, 5 × 6 == 31. So what do you guys think this expression returns? You can type it in the chat. Wow, y'all are so fast. Okay, we'll just quickly walk through this example to verify if what your guys' answers are correct. So here we see that within this major parentheses on the outside, we have this AND operator that connects both of these smaller parentheses. So that means both of these expressions have to be true in order for the entire expression to be true. So now let's evaluate the individual expressions inside. So the first one we have is 1 plus 2 equals 3. And obviously this 1 plus 2 is 3 and 3 is equal to 3. So this first expression is true. And then the second expression is a little more complicated because it has like a not symbol in front of it. But let's just ignore that for now and look at the inner parentheses expression. So we have 5 times 6 equals 31. 5 times 6 is equal to 30. And 30 is not equal to 31. So this inner parentheses expression would be false. But then looking on the outside, we have this not symbol in front of it, which means take whatever this expression value is, like if it's true, then make it false, and if it's false, make it true. And since we evaluated this to false, that means we want to make this entire thing true. So now we have true for the first statement and true for the second statement. So you guys are correct. This entire statement is true because we have both statements as true, and this AND operator evaluates whether both of the conditions are true. So this is true. Now moving on to conditional statements as a whole. So we've covered what individual conditions are and how we construct different expressions using operators. But now we're going to go into kind of, I guess, taking a step back and viewing conditional statements from a more high level. So you can think of conditional statements as basically a crossroad decision that you have to make. So you have an if and an else. I guess you have an if statement that you want to evaluate, and you have an else, which contains the other action that you want to do if the statement within the if is not true. So a condition is, again, an expression that evaluates to true or false, and if the condition is true, then you want to do the thing inside the curly braces. And so here is a more involved example of what the if statement does. So here we have a variable called x, and it's assigned a value of 5. And then we have this function called number equal, which takes in a number parameter. And then within this function, we have two separate if statements. Yeah, so I'll give you guys a few minutes to think about what does number equal 5 output, and likewise, what does number equal 4 output, and what does number equal 3 output? Or sorry, not output, but, or I guess, yeah, it does output a console print statement, but it doesn't return anything. But yeah, just type what you guys think would happen when you call the number equal function on 5, 4, and 3. Okay, since no one has typed anything in the chat, I'm just gonna walk over it myself. So basically for the first one, when we call number equal on 5, we pass in 5 as the number here, and we compare it with the number 5 in the first condition statement. So 5 is equal to 5, so therefore if console.logs number is equal to 5. Yay! And then we move on to the second statement, which is if number is greater than 4. And 5 is greater than 4, so also console.logs number is greater than 4. And then if we do number equal on 4, it would basically not satisfy this condition, and it would also not satisfy this condition. So basically that prints nothing. And then the same goes for the number 3. So if you pass in 3 as a number, it's not equal to 5, so it doesn't print anything here. And it's also not greater than 4, so it doesn't print anything here. And you might notice that like this seems kind of fishy. Like I feel like this function is not supposed to do what it's currently doing. And you're probably right. It's because we're not using the else statement. So if we modify this to include the else statement, basically this function is checking if the number is equal to 5, then it prints that. But if it's not equal to 5, then you do the else statement, which basically outputs the number is not equal to 5. So what do you guys think would happen here if you ran a number equal on the values 5, 4, and 3? I kind of gave it away, so I'm just going to run through it myself again. Basically, this function, it takes in a number, checks if it's equal to 5, and then it outputs that is equal to 5. And if it's not equal to 5, then it outputs that's not equal to 5. So that's pretty like intuitive, I would say. So if you ran it on 5, 4, and 3, it would print out numbers equal to 5 for the number 5, and it would print out number is not equal to 5 for the values 4 and 3. Okay, you can also do else if statements. So if you want to make these conditions more specific, or if you just want to add more conditional statements that you want to evaluate, you can add an else if condition after any if conditions. So this is what you can do if you want to compare if a number is greater than 4. So yeah, I'm not going to give it away this time, but you guys can put down in the chat what you think will output when you run number equal on 6, 5, and 4. Okay, someone just put their answers in the chat, and let's see if they're correct. Okay, so first number equal on 6. So we pass in 6 as a number. We evaluate it for the first expression, which compares whether it's equal to 5, and 6 is not equal to 5, so it skips this statement. And then it moves on to the else if here, which compares the number 6 with 4. 6 is greater than 4, so it outputs numbers greater than 4. So that is correct. And because you already went into this expression, you're not going to evaluate anything after that. Number equal on 5 would return number is equal to 5 because it already satisfies the very first condition. So it would print this out and then exit immediately. And then for number equal on 4, so if you pass in 4 as a number, and it evaluates the first expression, which is false because 4 is not equal to 5, and it evaluates the second expression, which is also false because 4 is not greater than 4. So it goes to the last statement, which is just the else statement. And because it didn't satisfy any of the previous conditions, it will output numbers less than 5. So yeah, you got it. That was correct. Okay, now we'll go into a demo that kind of demonstrates how you can essentially use JavaScript events to modify the styles of the elements on the page. Okay, let me go to the JS bin link. Okay, hopefully you guys can all see this JS bin window right now. So we have here the HTML, and we have CSS, the JavaScript, and also the console. This is kind of a lot at once, but just we can ignore the CSS for now because we don't really need to modify that. And we want to just keep the HTML open so we know like exactly what we're trying to access as the objects. So here we have a button and a list. So we want to assign the values of the objects from the HTML DOM to these variables. So first, we want to make the button the object that corresponds to this button right here in HTML. So let's just use getElementById because we have an ID for this element, and that ID is button. So now we've assigned this object to the variable button. And let me just clear this console because it's a lot. Okay, and then for a list, we can try to do this with querySelector, and it will be like almost exactly the same as the document.getElementById. But instead here, we use the hashtag. So we notice that in the HTML, this list is basically this entire div. And we want to change that, or we want to assign that entire div to this element or to this variable called list. And it has the ID list. So we can just do hashtag list here. Okay. And let me clear this console again. Okay, so moving on to actually implementing the toggle dark mode function. So the toggle dark mode function is basically just toggling the dark mode style on this entire page. So if it's already in dark mode, then you want to toggle it back to light mode. But if it's in light mode, then we want to toggle the dark mode. So we want to turn the dark mode on. Here we have a Boolean variable called isDarkMode that basically contains either a true or false value based on whether the list already has the dark class. So yeah, basically we use this console.log line here to verify like what the variable isDarkMode is. So if you like ran this in the browser, it would output a true or false value in the console based on whether the list contains the class dark or doesn't contain the class dark. So basically what we want to do is to write a conditional statement. So we have the if statement here followed by an else statement. And remember the curly braces because this is basically like a code block that you want to run if the statement or the expression here is satisfied. So basically our conditional statement is if there's a dark mode, or yeah, if isDark mode is true, then we want to turn off the dark mode. But if it's not true, basically if the dark mode is not on, then we want to turn on the dark mode. So we're essentially doing the opposite of like what it is right now. So we can put isDark mode here as the expression. So basically this is saying like if isDark mode true. And basically what we want to do here is to turn it off. So we've defined the button and list here, and we can use that to modify the property of the class list. So button.classList.remove. And I guess you can look at the CSS now for this, but the class is called dark, so we just want to remove dark. And then the same goes for the list. And then the else statement is basically what happens if is dark mode false. So we want to turn it on. So button.classList.add dark, and then list.classList.add dark. Okay, so this is essentially what you want to do with the toggle dark mode function. So just to like run through it again, like if the dark mode is on, like basically if the list already has the class dark, then we want to remove it. But if it doesn't already have the class dark, then we want to add it. So that's what's happening here. Now you might see that like it's not actually doing anything right now. And that's because we haven't assigned this function to the onClick property. So we actually haven't like taken advantage of the JavaScript event. So what we want to do here is to replace this null with the name of the function that we want to call, which is toggle dark mode. And now when we run it and we click on this button, it should change from dark mode back to light mode and light mode back to dark mode every time you press it. And you can see here that like the console is logging the correct values of its dark mode. So if you press this, so it's currently on dark mode, right? And if you press the button, it'll change to light mode and it outputs true. That's because is dark mode was true before we press the button. And so it runs this code block right here. So it removes the dark class and now we see the light mode. And then on the other hand, if we press the button now, it should output false in the console and it should change it to the dark mode. So it should run this code block, which adds the dark class to the button in the list. Nice. Okay, so this is basically the gist of the demo. But yeah, as Howie said in the chat, for those who've done homework 8, so for those who did homework 8, we basically just programmed the toggle function. So if I replace this entire code with just like, if I replace this with button.classList.toggle dark, it essentially does the exact same thing as what we did before, but just in a very concise way. So yeah, it's basically running all of the conditional statements for us, and it's just doing all of the work and like toggling the class dark. So basically, if it doesn't have the class dark, it adds it, and if it already has the dark class, then it removes it. So this is a much shorter and faster way to write the exact same code as we did before. Yeah, that's it for the demo. Does anyone have questions about the demo or anything else we covered in the presentation? If not, we'll take a 5-minute break.
Hello. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about accessibility in design this week. So essentially, accessibility refers to the practice of building digital content and applications that can be used by a wide range of people, including individuals who have visual, motor, auditory, speech, or cognitive disabilities. But you'll find as I talk through or discuss this topic more that it's not strictly limited to digital content and applications. And it's also not strictly limited to people who have disabilities either. But that's like a good way to start thinking about it. I highly recommend reading this article. It's pretty short, covers some kind of similar things to what I'm going to talk about. And it's just a really nice summary for you to look back on after this class. So how can we design for accessibility? Here's an example of something that you've probably seen people use. It'd be surprising if you didn't. And wheelchairs are probably something we think of maybe first when we think of disability or designing for accessibility in making space for people who have wheelchairs and designing around that, at least in terms of physical space or physical design. But not all people who have physical disabilities are in a wheelchair. And it turns out that also wheelchairs are actually not accessibly designed for the people that are supposed to be using them even. So wheelchairs were actually designed to be based on chairs of able people, but it turns out that wheelchairs, especially in terms of the storage, are really not designed for the people using wheelchairs, and kind of exacerbates their feelings of dependency on their caretakers and kind of makes it difficult for them to live their own lives comfortably, healthily, and successfully, I guess. Like as you can see on the left, both forms of storage are very difficult for somebody who has very limited motor control to reach. A lot of people who use wheelchairs are paralyzed throughout most of their body. They cannot reach things that are that far behind them, nor can they reach things that are that far below them. And it's designs like this that really ignore or kind of assume that they have someone pushing the chair, someone with them at all times, when that's not really the case. Additionally, but since wheelchairs are based off of chairs for abled people, it kind of ignores ways that it might exacerbate the person's health problems. Part of the reason I know about all of this is that I volunteered to help administer yoga therapy to members of the disabled community. And we had to work out their muscles and all the knots in them that were created or worsened by wheelchairs, because sitting in this kind of posture actually isn't very comfortable for them and actually can make their existing chronic pain even worse, and also increase the paralysis in their body. It can be really bad for a number of different disabilities, and they're generally just created to be more efficient for society as a whole rather than for the individual that actually needs it, and just so that it can seem even relatively normal compared to other people. And that's not even very true anymore. So avoid creating something like the wheelchair for people, and think about how you can actually make sure that the person who's using it, the users, will actually benefit from the design you make. And it's not just for, I don't know how to put this, what might be believed as the majority of people, or based on assumptions made about quote unquote normal people or non-minorities. That's just an example to get into this. So here we're going to get into another kind of example with a quick thought experiment. Imagine the power goes out in your apartment or in your house. You don't have your phone or any form of light available to you. Think about what kinds of things would be the hardest to use without light. And this is inspired by an article about how this designer and author visited her blind friend, and she was like stumbling around in their house because they didn't have to turn the lights on because they couldn't see anyways. And it's moments like that that make you realize and step outside of your experience to kind of empathize more with the people you're designing for and the people you might not be considering. So yeah, like for example, using the microwave or the stove would be super hard to use without light, because a lot of those instructions and a lot of those labels are written or painted on or something in a way that's not very, I guess, there's no real way that it's communicated to people who can't see. They're very based on visual information, and people who don't have that kind of information struggle to use a lot of everyday things. It's getting better, but think about what kinds of things there would be an issue with. So now, kind of based on that, imagine instead that there is a divider that you can't see through that goes in between you and your phone or computer. Think about what kinds of things would be hardest to do on your device that maybe you've memorized the keys on your keyboard so you know how to type things. But navigating websites that you're unfamiliar with would be really hard. And I'm sure it's really hard for you to navigate other things on your computer or get to the right place. So in general, what these examples are trying to convey is that you should step outside of your own experience. Being designers, we tend to draw on our own experience, and that can make our design stronger. But when we're designing for people who are very different from us, it's very important that we put aside our own biases from our own experiences and really try to empathize with the people that we're trying to create for. And having their voice in the design process is very important. So that all this is great and all and important, but how can we incorporate this into web design, like for this class or for your personal projects, etc.? So here's an example. You'd want to have high contrast in symbols. So having different colors isn't enough to denote different sections or things that are supposed to be different on a page or an image. For example, in Among Us, they had to update this task so that included different colors and different shapes, so that people who are colorblind or have other visual deficiencies would be able to tell the difference between different aspects of the task and the different wires. You can see here that each one of these colors are actually the same value level and are only different hues. So that doesn't provide good enough contrast between each other for people to actually see if they're colorblind. And it's very hard to tell the difference or which ones actually go together. More about contrast. It's very common for forms to have very light text in the boxes that you're supposed to type in. I would say that this dribble example is just okay. It's not awful because they do have the question above the text box. Oops. But make sure that you try to avoid, if at all possible, putting that kind of text within the box, because many people who have bad eyesight, especially if they're very nearsighted or very farsighted, other visual issues, or if they're blind, the sight readers won't pick that up. It's just very important that you try to avoid putting text in those boxes, because the low contrast, it doesn't show up very well. Try to just label each boxes distinctly and with high contrast. Yes, another way that you can design accessibly, this is kind of actually coding accessibly, but if you include alt text in your HTML, which is basically a description of what your images are showing, then it helps people who rely on sight readers, which basically read all the text that's on the site and tell the user what information is on the site, what the image is of, and that there is an image at all. Because a lot of images that don't have alt text, people just know that there's an image, but they don't know what the information they're supposed to get from it is. So having detailed alt text that describes what it is that you're looking at can be really beneficial for these people. Another good practice is to use the tags nav and main in HTML. So for the nav bar and for the main menu, users with physical and visual disability rely heavily on using the keyboard, arrows and tab especially, because users with physical disability may not have the ability to use all of their fingers on the keyboard as flexibly as able people are. So using these tags will help with that. Otherwise, the other parts of it are a little bit out of the scope of the class. So feel free to do research on that. But basically what these tags do is allow for you to click through different parts of the menu and just with the arrow keys, and people don't have to otherwise they can't do it, basically. So yeah, navigation is really important if you think about it. Making sure that you can get from one page to another is extremely important, not just for people who have disabilities of cognitive, visual, or physical disabilities, but it just helps people as a whole. Those with language barriers, you want it to have your designs be as widely accessible, inclusive, etc. Because not just because it means that you'll have more users and that's good for your company or whoever you're designing for, but also it really prevents people from being frustrated with your site. You really don't know what someone might be going through when they access your site. So you want to make sure that it is a smooth and easy process for everybody. Yeah, as I was just saying, designing inclusively isn't just about disability. So think about different backgrounds people might have. A really common thing is on the census, on your SAT, at the doctor's office, and so many other places, you are asked what your ethnic group is, and depending on what options you have available, people may or may not feel welcome or included. As a mixed person, and understand how difficult this is, either being forced to pick one of the races that I am or not seeing one of the options, not being able to say that I'm two or more races or mixed can be really frustrating. And having to click other at some points is also frustrating because that literally others you. If you've heard that phrase, makes you feel really included, in being called other is kind of never a good thing. So think about how that might apply to things other than race, maybe sexuality, maybe other user groups that you're not considering. So in general, when you design, you want to think about who aren't we considering right now and who might we be including? What if you can't build enough in to meet the needs of a particular group that you may be excluding? What can you do for now? There's always some little things like adding those tags, making sure you have good contrast, which are just good practice in design in general. You want to make sure that you have structure set up so that you can always be more inclusive and accessible in the future, if not now. From a very high level, you want to think about, for your website or for the product that you're building, how easy is it for anybody to use our product? And really stressing that anyone. There are always people that you're not going to be considering, always other groups. The world includes such a diverse array of backgrounds and experiences and identities that it's important for you to consider. So here's a few suggestions on how to design inclusively. Here are some resources too. So Color Oracle helps with, you can test out sites as if you're colorblind. On Windows, WebAIM checks whether or not your contrast is good enough, and also has some other accessibility articles and tools to help make sure that what you're designing is accessible. Contrast, there's a Mac app that helps check for contrast as well. And the AXE Chrome extension tests any site for accessibility violations. So you can either test your own or look at other ones that you thought you liked, and you may find that actually it breaks a bunch of rules. Other than this, a lot of companies have their own set of accessibility guidelines. So if you work at it as a designer or a front-end developer at a company, they probably have some list of guidelines on how to design accessibly. Some companies may advertise this as like a reason why they're hip with the kids or why they're a better moral company. But that's something else to consider as well. If you're designing on your own and not for a company, using these resources may help make up for that. And just doing your research on what kind of users there are is a huge plus for your portfolio. Some other suggestions I have for designing inclusively is to go out of your way to be curious about other people and other experiences. Like that semester I spent volunteering for the disabled community was really life-changing and really changed my perspective in a lot of ways. And just in general, trying to get out there virtually or in real life. I know we're still in a pandemic, but it's still possible. You can find other perspectives and other experiences that are foreign to you, and that can help inform the way you design. But most importantly, staying creative and finding creative ways to incorporate accessibility and to be the most welcoming you can be for any user. So yeah, any questions?